Good morning and welcome back to Dr. Logic Awkwardly Talks about the historiography of Western and Eastern logic. Now, much of what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of videos isn't my own research or anything like that. I'm drawing heavily on an extremely good chapter on Indian logic and the Culmination of Reasoning by Jonathan Ganeri. I cannot recommend this chapter highly enough. It has way more information and history and background and argumentation than I can ever cover in these videos. So I definitely recommend that you check that out and read it. But what I want to talk about today is the introduction of Indian logic into the West. So many scare quotes going on. But I'm going to talk about this because it's important for understanding kind of how we should understand the sorts of logical developments in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions that I've been talking about in recent videos. So the first kind of major introduction of these of rationalist and logical texts in the Indian tradition into kind of the Western academic and intellectual culture came from a lecture by a guy named Henry Colebrooke, who was both a mathematician, so he had kind of understanding of the kind of formal side of things, and also an Orientalist, so he could read Sanskrit and other relevant languages. So he gave a talk to the Royal Asiatic Society on February 21st, 1824, where he gave an account of an early Hindu text on logic by Akshapada Gautama called the Nyaya-sutras. So the Nyaya school is a school of Hinduism which was kind of developing kind of at the same time as Buddhism and had many shared features in terms of their logic and understanding. The Nyaya-sutras were written sometime between 200 BC and 150 AD. We don't know anything more specific than that. But in this text, we see something that is very much like the early form of the three-step argument that we saw in Dignaga. In fact, I'm going to give kind of Colebrooke's summary of the type of argumentation that is found in the Nyaya Sutras. It's not a three-step argument, but it's a five-step one. It's going to be a variation on the familiar fiery mountain one that we've seen before. So this is what Colebrooke says in his lecture. He says that a regular argument or syllogism, so here the Sanskrit word for argument is in fact just nyaya. So the Nyaya school of Hinduism was the one that was focusing on logic, reasoning, etc. Consists of five members: avayava, that's how to pronounce it, or component parts. First, the proposition or the pratanya. Second, the reason, the hetu or apadesa. Third, the instance, the udaharana or nidarshana. Fourth, the application, the upanaya. Fifth, the conclusion, the nigamana. For example, this hill is fiery. So this is the thesis or the proposition or the pratanya. Why? Because it smokes. There's the statement of our hetu. What smokes is fiery like a hearth or a kitchen. So this is in Vasubandhu and Dignaga's vocabulary, the statement of pervasion plus the drishtanta. Here, this instance is called a udaharana or nidarsana. Accordingly, the hill is smoking. This is the application, the upanaya, and then fifth step. Therefore, it is fiery. And this is the conclusion, the nigamana. So what you can see is that this form of argument with the 5 steps is basically the 3-step argument plus the addition of the application and the conclusion. So steps 4 and 5. Accordingly, the hill is smoking, therefore it is fiery. So what we're doing is we are taking the general statement in step 3 and applying it to the hill, and then drawing the inference at step 5. So this was particularly interesting to the members of the audience at the Royal Asiatic Society, because this looks very much like formal reasoning. And it looks much more like the sort of formal reasoning that was available to people in the early 19th century. So it's important to keep in mind that in 1824, when Colebrooke gave this lecture, this is prior to the developments of propositional logic as we know it. That happened at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't even until the middle of the 19th century that you start getting Boolean algebra and Boolean logic. So at the time that Colebrooke is presenting this material, kind of the touchstone for forms of good reasoning is the Aristotelian syllogistic. And you can see this in the fact that he translated nyaya as syllogism. And so this entire construction became known as the Indian syllogism, or the Hindu syllogism. Now, 2 things come out of this. First of all, so there's kind of 2 points of significance that I'd like to highlight. And this is, again, following Guarneri. He is the one who was kind of articulating why this lecture was so important. The first is that, so I'm going to just read from Guarneri's paper because he says it better than I could. The first reason this is important is because European philosophers were presented for the first time with Indian materials that unquestionably had for their subject matter ideas and theories closely akin to those of the Greek founders of Western philosophy. This isn't the sort of kind of abstract, tantric, spiritual sort of philosophy that you often associate with Hinduism or Buddhism or any of those traditions. This is very much like what Western philosophers were doing. So, as Guarneri says, in short, the Nyaya-sutra could almost have been a work of Greek philosophy. The belief that this challenged was that Europe, as a consequence of its classical cultural inheritance, had a privileged position of intellectual authority. So I've talked about how there was this kind of continuous tradition, not only in logic, but in kind of intellectual culture more generally, from Aristotle all the way up through modern times. Even though kind of like bits of knowledge fell out and were rediscovered, you can still trace an unbroken path in kind of Western European philosophical, intellectual, and logical culture to Aristotle. If suddenly you now have this separate tradition, presumably independent, though there was a lot of question of, well, did the Indians get their syllogisms from the Greeks? Did the Greeks get theirs from India? Did Alexander the Great have any connection? Did Aristotle's texts actually make it to ancient India and provide the seeds for these developments? There was a lot of questions about this because there was a certain amount of threat that came from the idea that there was an intellectual culture and tradition that was not rooted in ancient Greece, in this classical inheritance, that came up with the same sorts of ideas. It's hard to say your own cultural your own kind of intellectual culture is dominant or is better or is more important. There's another separate culture out there that was doing exactly the same things you were doing. So the second kind of point of importance for Colebrooke's lecture, again, quoting from Guarneri, Colebrooke presented for the first time his discovery of an Indian account of reasoning, and he used the term syllogism to describe it. Unwittingly, perhaps, Colebrooke implied that the ancient Indians were aware of the syllogism as the ancient Greeks. How could it be that the syllogism, the great discovery of the Greeks, and one of the key factors to which was due the West's superiority in the development of reason and science, how could it be that this self-same syllogism should have been known to ancient Indians? In other words, the problem was whether Colebrooke's discovery could be made consistent with the European self-understanding of its intellectual superiority over its colonies. This was the critical question Colebrooke's lecture posed and the reason for its significance. So on kind of the one level, it was significant because it was the first time this Sanskrit material was kind of was presented and made accessible to a Western audience. But at a much more kind of higher, at the meta level of significance, the simple existence of this material called into question this dominant tradition that understood kind of European colonialism as justified because it had this intellectual cultural superiority. If you truly think that this is the case, then colonialization makes sense because you want to go out and kind of bring your better culture to everybody else. All of a sudden, we are now faced with a position where it's like, well, but wait a minute. This other intellectual culture that we have been denigrating all of this time was developing the same sorts of things that we were doing. Suddenly, this idea that that kind of Western intellectual cultural superiority, or that Western intellectual culture was superior, and that we could then use this superiority as a justification for colonialism, this is all becoming called into question. Now, I'm going to talk more about this second point about understanding this five-step argument form as a syllogism and kind of the negative consequences for the understanding of Indian logic that kind of fell out of Colebrooke's use of language in this way. But I really want to stress home the point about kind of undermining colonialism. Why do we define logic the way that we do in this entire series of almost 150 videos talking about what is logic? It is because we should not be privileging any one intellectual culture over another. The Western account of logic is a good account. It's beautiful. It's lovely. We can do wonderful things with it. I love it. But it's not the only one. It's also not necessarily the superior one. It works very well for its contexts, but these contexts are not the only contexts out there. There is no kind of any kind of universal justification for always using predicate logic as the best tool for understanding things. No. And I wanted to set up this series of videos from the start so that we were not working from this kind of privileging of this Western intellectual culture. We need to define logic in such a way that all of these approaches get to count equally legitimately, taken as logic in their own rights, and not insofar as they can be reduced to what we understand logic to be in the Western intellectual tradition. So, of all of the places where you might expect to find anti-colonial propaganda, you might not have expected to find it in your Introduction to Logic series of videos. Nevertheless, it's probably one of the most important take-home messages that you can get from this series of videos. That questions of definition, which you might think, oh, logic, doesn't matter how you define it, it's just a matter of definition. But definitions have consequences. What we decide to accept as logic and what we decide to exclude as logic is not a value neutral thing. So I've made it clear from the start that I have a very expansive view of logic. And part of the reason I have this expansive view is because I do not think that we should be privileging the Western intellectual culture simply because for a couple of millennia, we thought it was dominant, simply because we did not know what other intellectual cultures were doing. Oh, look, you got Dr. Logic awkwardly gives you a rant on colonialism in her logic videos. Join me next time and we will get back to talking about logic. And I want to explore this idea of this five-step argument form that Colebrooke was talking about, and the way and kind of the consequences of him calling it a syllogism. So join me next time for more fun. Take care and see you then. Cheers.